I'm sorry to say there are no Americans apparently willing to tighten their belt. And certainly there are no politicians willing to pay the price politically to ensure that we slow down. So, the prognosis is not very good. Americans will continue to borrow. The government will continue to borrow. Everybody will live like they had everything. And in approximately 30 years, the final collapse of the economy in North America. Now that was, of course, 36 years ago. I've been watching it all along. When I finished my master's degree in business administration and started teaching for Andrews University in the Caribbean, I began to do some studies more on it, and with my students we'd analyze some of the trends. And sure enough, that curve was just coming down like this until, I mean, you can survive so long. I mean, you can borrow and borrow and borrow, but if the time comes when your creditors say, "Excuse me, you can't even pay the interest." Once you can't even pay the interest, then we have a real problem, right? As long as you make your payments, your regular payments to the bank is happy with you. They don't care if you don't have enough money to eat. They don't care. As long as you make your payment. But the moment you say, "I have to eat, I can't pay the bank anymore," boom, you got a problem. The bank says, "We've reached a point of no return." And so, 2 years ago, I was in France. I was having a week there, a spiritual emphasis week with several churches in Paris. And somebody handed me a French magazine, but it had an English translation with it. I guess they issue their things in their publications in English and French. This organization only produces magazines and publications for its members who subscribe. But on this particular occasion, they said, for the first time, we are releasing a public statement, not just to our members. This is 2006. We are releasing a statement to the world. We'd like to let the world know that the United States government Congress has officially voted, since they can no longer pay the interest on their debt. Even if they spent everything the government earned, the entire amount would not be enough to service the interest on the debt. So you reach a point where you're a slave. The United States government just began a war. They had a war in Afghanistan that we're finishing, and they just began a war in Iraq, and then they had the security changes in North America. You know how expensive it is to hire a lot of TSA officers everywhere? They're all federal employees, you know, and their retirement and their benefits. And who's going to pay for all of that? I had mentioned in previous sermons that the government was approximately printing $500 million a day. I was terribly wrong. I've discovered evidence since then, published in magazines, that the minimum cost for this is $2 billion a day. $2 billion. I had read before it was estimated at that, but now there's evidence that the cost is $2 billion a day. So the government has been printing $2 billion a day in cash to service the interest on the loan, which happens to be $57 trillion approximately, the latest figures, if you count the internal and the public debt, like in Social Security, what you owe your people when they put it in. And so just to pay the interest on $57 trillion is so high that everything the government makes in taxes is not enough to pay the interest. So what do? You print money. You write false checks. You know, governments are just like people. Do you know that? In other words, if you want to know how a government works in finances, you want to simplify it. I mean, it's not simple, but you want to kind of get an idea. It's exactly the way a person, whatever you make is all you have to spend. Now you can borrow, but you have to have assets to borrow against. And when you run out of assets, this is called slavery, financial slavery. Because now you're not borrowing against something you own, you're borrowing against your own life. It means you go to debtor's prison in the old days. It means you sold your children into slavery to pay the debt. Because there's nothing you have that can pay off the debt. In Jesus' time, when he talked about, the king forgiving the debt, he was talking about debtor's prison, being a slave the rest of your life. Or they come and take your children by force and take them into slavery and say, okay, the debt is canceled, we'll just sell your children as slaves. And so, the United States government decided to print money, and they voted in 2006. The Congress voted two things. In February of 2006, they voted to print all the money they needed to finance the war and to pay the interest on the debt and to do the security measures. $2 billion a day. That's good enough. With $2 billion, you can pay the soldiers. You can pay for the fuel. You can pay the interest. And we can still keep going. Miracle of miracles, we're still going. That's like writing a check to pay all your bills. You come home and you just write false checks to everybody. You come home and say, guess what, honey? I paid all the bills today. Man, let's sleep. Oh, you did, honey? Oh, it's wonderful. We're going to sleep well tonight. For a couple days. Because the banks are going to come get you. You understand? It always comes home to roost. The rooster comes, how do you say that? Yeah. The chickens come home to roost eventually. You know, when you speak different languages, you don't remember which phrase is what. And anyway, we started doing it. The second thing, in March, they voted something else. They voted no longer to print the M3 figures, which is the monetary aggregate. All governments make financial statements, just like the bank wants to know how much you're worth. You say, I have my house, I have my car, I have so much in the bank, I have some properties, I have this, my business, it's worth so much, my debt is so much, I am worth the difference, I'm worth this much. Well, governments do that too. Every time they print money, they print it out to show the world what they're worth. That's called M3, monetary aggregate. The total aggregate of all the money they printed. I was sitting on an airplane. A young lady was next to me, and she was talking about we were talking about it. She didn't quite understand how it worked. So I got my glass of water, and I said, let's imagine this water is all the water in the world. It's worth more than gold. And let's imagine that I could have it, but of course if I was going to distribute water to everybody to pay my bills, it's kind of hard. So I'm gonna come up with a thing called money. And I'm going to print $4 bills. And I'm going to say, I could give you water, but I would rather give you paper. So as long as you have one of these $4 bills, each one of these is worth a quarter of a glass of water. Correct? Just anytime you want water, just come, turn it into us, and we'll give you a quarter cup of water. But then you can give it, if you owe somebody a quarter cup of water, just give them the paper. And then they just pay each other with paper, and everybody knows if they ever really need the water, they can come get it. If you don't need water, just pay the paper around. Okay, good, no problem. And then I decide to print twice as many. Now I tell everybody, I've printed twice as many. So now, the same cup of water, now if I had 2 cups of water, they would still be worth the same amount. Each one's still worth half a cup, a quarter of a cup. But if I only have 1 glass of water, now each one of these is worth 1/8 of a cup, correct? That's called inflation. I can now buy less with the same money. In this case, it was 100% inflation. It's now worth 1/8 of a cup, and it's worth half as much as it was. Of course, you understand it's usually a percentage, 2%, 4%, 5%.